Welcome to the Sleep and History channel. Let's get ready. Today, we're going back to the Middle Ages together again. And we're diving into a topic you're going to love. What kind of punishments did criminals get in the Middle Ages? I'm sure you've wondered about it a lot, just like I have. Before we start the video, where are you listening to me from right now, and what are you doing? Don't forget to write to me in the comments. Reading your comments makes me very happy. If you're ready, let's begin. Throughout the Middle Ages, the justice system was fundamentally different from modern approaches. In that period, a crime was not only seen as an act committed against secular laws, but also considered a sin against God. This religious influence led to the widespread use of methods that sought divine intervention and supernatural signs rather than logical evidence in the application of the law. Determination of guilt or innocence was often subjected to unusual tests far removed from reason and evidence. One of the most striking justice methods of this period was ordeals or, in its Latin name, ordalia. It was believed that these tests left a person's fate directly to divine judgment. The best-known ordeals were the ordeal of hot iron. The suspect had to carry a red-hot iron for a certain time. Then their hands were bandaged, and a few days later, the condition of the wound was examined. If the wound had begun to heal, the person was considered innocent. If it had become infected, they were considered guilty. The ordeal of water, cold water. The suspect, usually bound, was thrown into water. If they sank, they were considered innocent, because the water had accepted them. If they floated, they were considered guilty, because the water had rejected them. The ordeal of the blessed morsel, particularly applied among clergy. The suspect was expected to swallow a consecrated piece of bread without choking. A person who couldn't swallow or choked was declared guilty. The deep belief that God would protect the innocent and expose the guilty lay at the heart of such trials. Gathering evidence, witness statements, or logical inferences, elements that form the basis of today's law, were usually secondary in these processes. However, the concept of justice was not limited to ordeals. In the later Middle Ages, especially with the rediscovery of Roman law, trial methods based on human will also began to develop. Kings, local lords, and city councils established their own courts and began issuing written laws. Other forms of justice that emerged during this period included oral testimony and oath. In courts, it was believed that parties and witnesses were telling the truth by swearing an oath. Perjury was a serious crime from both secular and religious perspectives. Trial by combat, duel, particularly common among the nobility. This method allowed two parties to resolve their issues through armed combat. It was believed that the winner of the duel was righteous because God had granted them victory. This reflected a justice concept based on strength. Torture to extract confessions. Torture, one of the darkest aspects of law, was a frequently used method to prove guilt. Confessions given under pain were generally accepted as truth in court decisions, especially by church and royal courts. In the Middle Ages, it was also a significant feature that punishments and executions were often carried out in public squares, in front of the populace. This aimed to serve as a lesson and deterrent to the public, showing that fear was used as an effective tool in crime prevention. In summary, the Middle Ages concept of justice was quite distant from today's rational, evidence-based legal systems. Beliefs, traditions, and often raw power shaped the way justice was administered. Both the unusual tests left to divine providence and the cruel methods applied by human hands turned the legal system of this period into a complex and dark picture. Justice in the Middle Ages was far from modern concepts like rehabilitation or dispensing justice. Its main purpose was to keep society under control through fear and terror. Punishments not only punished the criminal but also taught a lesson to the entire society, aiming to deter anyone thinking of committing a crime. Therefore, executions and punishments were carried out in front of the public, in marketplaces, and on busy thoroughfares. Gallows, torture platforms, and exhibition poles were set up in places easily visible to the public, thus maximizing the effect of the punishment. For example, punishments like cutting off the hand of a thief or the tongue of someone who slandered were directly related to the crime and visually striking. A sense of revenge and justice, retaliation, lex talionis. In medieval justice, the feelings of revenge-seeking and the pursuit of justice by victims and society were important. The severe punishment given to the criminal provided both the victim and society with a sense that justice had been served. This often operated on the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, lex talionis. For example, someone who cut off another's hand would have their hand cut off, or someone who caused death would be executed. Such punishments quelled social anger and created the perception that order had been restored. Social control and display of authority. Penal mechanisms were also tools to consolidate the authority and power of the ruler or the church. Public executions demonstrated how ruthless authority could be, ensuring social obedience. These spectacles were a way to suppress revolts, facilitate tax collection, and generally intimidate the populace to strengthen central power. Executioners and officials representing the justice of the king or feudal lord were concrete symbols of this power. This fear-based legal system, while appearing inhumane and cruel by modern standards, served a kind of order-providing function when considering the social structure, technological capabilities, and weakness of central authority of that era. This dark side of the law is a critical key to understanding the complex dynamics of medieval societies and how their concept of justice evolved. Justice in the Middle Ages didn't work on the principle of proportional punishment according to the severity of the crime as we understand it today. Sometimes even a tiny theft could have terrible and fatal consequences. Fear, seen as the most effective way to maintain order in society, formed the basis of punishments. Therefore, living in an era where stealing an apple could lead you to the gallows in the town square was like a real horror movie. Theft and its punishments. In medieval societies, maintaining order, especially in rural areas and cities, was a major challenge due to the weakness of central authority. To fill this void, the severe and public punishment of even the smallest crime was adopted. Theft was one of the most common crimes of the period, and its punishments were unbelievably harsh by today's standards. The seriousness of theft. In the Middle Ages, theft was seen not only as an economic loss but also as a serious violation of property rights and social order. Especially in times of widespread poverty and famine, stealing a piece of bread or a small animal could be perceived as a vital threat. For instance, the theft of a few sheep from a farmer in the countryside could mean his entire family starving. This helps us understand why punishments for theft were so severe. The gallows and other severe punishments. One of the most common and symbolic punishments for theft was the gallows. A person caught stealing, even of small value, could easily lose their life on the gallows. Executions were usually public spectacles, carried out in the busiest city square or by a roadside for all to see. This was to directly intimidate potential criminals and increase the deterrent effect of the punishment. Public executions also had the quality of entertainment or spectacle. Crowds would gather to watch. As a lesson, the criminal's hanged body was sometimes left on the gallows for days or weeks, becoming a cautionary sign for all passers-by. This was a form of punishment where the criminal was humiliated and reminded even after death. Other severe punishments for theft. Besides the gallows, other severe punishments were applied. Maiming. In cases considered less severe, the thief's hand or fingers might be cut off. This aimed to prevent the criminal from stealing again and to brand them in society. Branding. A mark was burned onto the criminal's face or a visible part of their body with a hot iron, ensuring they were easily recognized in society. Exile or enslavement. Rarely, thieves could be exiled from their lands or enslaved. The extreme severity of these punishments reflects the basic philosophy of medieval justice, to create fear to maintain order in society. Unlike modern legal systems, concepts like rehabilitation or reintegrating the criminal into society were almost non-existent. The important thing was to prevent crime from being committed and to sharply display the authorities' power. Even a tiny mistake could lead to an irreparable, cruel end. This meant living a life of constant fear and uncertainty in the Middle Ages, especially for the poor and vulnerable. The Inquisition and religious crimes. In the dark pages of the Middle Ages, there was a period when the shadow of the Church fell over every aspect of life, and law and justice also felt its impact. One of the most prominent faces of this shadow was the Inquisition courts that ravaged Europe for centuries. These courts were established not only to punish criminals but also to hunt and punish those who opposed the Church's doctrines, the heretics. These were not your ordinary trials. It was a system carried out in the name of God, instilling fear, and often resorting to cruel methods. The Inquisition, in the Middle Ages, it was a judicial system established by the Catholic Church, especially to combat heresy and protect the integrity of the Catholic faith. Although its foundations were laid in the late 12th century, it lived its most effective and terrifying period from the 13th century onwards, particularly with the Papal Inquisition run by Dominican monks. The Spanish Inquisition emerged much later, in the late 15th century, as a separate structure with its own unique ruthlessness. Goals and structure. The main goal of the Inquisition was to eliminate different interpretations within Christianity and beliefs considered heretical, e.g., beliefs of groups like the Cathars, Waldensians. The Church saw these groups not only as a religious threat but also as elements disrupting social order and political stability. Secret trials. Inquisition trials were usually conducted in secret. The accused had no right to know who had denounced them, and their defense opportunities were limited. Even the identities of those testifying against the accused could be kept secret during questioning. Use of torture. The Inquisition did not hesitate to use torture as a legal method to obtain confessions. The presumption of guilt lay with the accused, meaning the accused had to prove their innocence. A person thought to be guilty was usually forced to confess under torture. Religious and political power. The Inquisition drew power from both religious and political authority. Kings and local rulers often supported these activities of the Church because heresy was also perceived as political disorder. Trial process and punishments. The Inquisition process usually began with suspicions of heresy in a region. Inquisitors, often Dominican or Franciscan monks, would come to a city, inform the public, and grant a certain period of grace for those who thought they had committed heresy to denounce themselves. Those who confessed within this period usually received lighter punishments. However, the process was merciless for those who did not confess or were denounced. Interrogation and extracting confessions. The accused were subjected to long and exhausting interrogations and sometimes torture to make them confess. Confession was the most important evidence for the Inquisition. Punishments varied according to the severity of the crime and the sincerity of the confession. Light punishments, wearing certain garments like a penitent's robe, making donations to the church, public penance in church, or flogging. Medium punishments, excommunication, exclusion from the community, confiscation of property, imprisonment, usually for life or long-term, or exile. Severe punishments, death penalty. The harshest punishment was being burned at the stake for those who persisted in heresy or did not confess. These executions were usually carried out by the secular arms of the state, while the church avoided the responsibility of bloodshed. These executions had the nature of both a religious purification and a terrifying warning to the public. Witch hunts and the Inquisition, witch hunts, which intensified especially in the early modern period, were also conducted by Inquisition courts in many places. Since witchcraft meant collaboration with the devil, it was considered one of the gravest heresy crimes, and women accused of this crime were subjected to terrible tortures to force a confession and then burned. The Inquisition courts are a striking example of the religious fanaticism of the Middle Ages, the power vacuum, and how justice could become ruthless for the sake of cause. It affected the fate of hundreds of thousands of people and left deep marks on Europe's cultural and social fabric. Torture and its instruments. When medieval justice is mentioned, one of the first things that come to mind, unfortunately, is torture and the horrific instruments designed for these cruel acts. They say necessity is the mother of invention, but when the necessity is to extract confessions and suppress rebellions, the inventions that emerge take on inhumane forms. These instruments were used not only on criminals but sometimes on innocents. Just thinking that what was called law in that era was applied in a dark room accompanied by creaking iron and screams is chilling. Throughout the Middle Ages, torture was widely used both as a legal interrogation method and as a punishment tool. Especially the Inquisition courts of the Church and secular authorities courts resorted to various torture instruments to extract confessions from or punish those thought to be guilty. These instruments were designed to inflict the greatest possible pain on the human body, to break the victim psychologically and physically. The primary aim of torture was to force the person on trial to confess to the crime. The concept of evidence was not as developed as today. Confession was considered the strongest proof. In many cases, the accused had to confess to crimes they didn't commit under torture. Some of the most well-known and terrifying torture instruments of the period were the rack, perhaps one of the most well-known medieval torture instruments. The victim's arms and legs were stretched by a pulley system until joints dislocated and muscles and tendons tore. The aim was to inflict unbearable pain and force a confession. This instrument applied a slow and continuous torture. The Spanish boot. This instrument was a metal or leather boot placed on the victim's leg that crushed the bones as it was tightened. Wooden or metal wedges were inserted and tightened further, causing bones to break or crush. The head crusher, as the name suggests, this instrument was used to slowly crush the victim's head. It was a terrifying torture method that could go from breaking jaws to popping eyes. The Iron Maiden, although its emergence is more attributed to the late Middle Ages or early modern period, this instrument, a human-shaped cabinet with sharp spikes inside, is associated with the Middle Ages in legends. The victim was locked inside, and as the doors closed, the spikes pierced their body, leading to a slow and painful death. Water torture. The victim was tied to a board or water was poured directly into their mouth continuously to create a sensation of drowning. This psychological and physical torture would exhaust the victim completely, forcing them to confess. The wheel, especially used for heavy crimes like rebellion and murder, this instrument was designed for public executions. The victim's limbs were tied to a wheel, then the executioner would break their bones with iron bars. The victim, left alive, would be left on the wheel for days to face an exemplary death. Sawing, reportedly used especially in accusations of witchcraft or heresy, this method involved hanging the victim upside down and sawing them in half alive while still conscious. It is thought to have been an extremely cruel and rare practice. These torture instruments show how dark and cruel the paths taken in the name of delivering justice in the Middle Ages could be. These methods, besides being contrary to human dignity, also often led to false confessions and the punishment of innocent people. Humiliation and shame punishments. In the Middle Ages, the way to punish criminals wasn't just about inflicting pain. Sometimes the heaviest punishment was social exclusion and humiliation rather than physical pain. As they say, I wanted the ground to swallow me up. These punishments aimed exactly at that, to put the criminal before the public, make them an object of ridicule, and shatter their reputation within the community. Because a person who lost their reputation had no place in society. In medieval law, alongside physical torture and death penalties, publicly humiliating criminals was a common and effective form of punishment. These shame punishments did not physically maim the criminal but targeted their social status, honor, and reputation. The aim was to make the criminal a lesson for themselves and to give a deterrent message to other members of society against committing crimes. Such punishments were usually applied for lesser crimes or first-time offenders. But their effects could last a lifetime. Aims of shame punishments. Deterrence, applying the punishment publicly and visibly served as a direct warning to potential criminals. Social control, humiliating the criminal in front of the public reinforced that social norms and rules were inviolable. Learning a lesson, the shame experienced by the criminal served as a lesson for the observers, providing motivation to avoid similar behavior. Humiliating effect, the criminal's branding in society and loss of respectability was a heavy punishment for them. This situation also negatively affected their future social and economic life. Common shame punishments and instruments. The pillory/stocks, one of the most well-known shame instruments. Usually a wooden post or frame with holes to fix the head and hands. The criminal was attached to this instrument for hours or days in the busiest public places, market square, city gate, ridiculed, spat on, or pelted with rotten food by onlookers. The scold's bridle, or brank, a metal mask used especially to punish slanderous, gossiping, or quarrelsome women. This mask could have a spiked metal piece in the mouth area to hold the tongue in place. The victim was paraded in public with this mask or tied to a post. The foot stocks, similar to the pillory, but in this instrument, only the victim's feet were fixed. Although generally seen as a lighter shame punishment than the pillory, the victim was still subjected to public ridicule. Branding, burning a letter or symbol representing the crime, e.g., T for thief, M for murderer, onto the criminal's skin with a hot iron. This permanent mark branded the criminal for life in society, constantly reminding them of their identity and crime. Public flogging/beating, the criminal was usually flogged or beaten in front of the public in the city square or streets. This was a punishment that inflicted both physical pain and shame. Shame masks or hats in animal figures or comical shapes representing the crime committed were forced on the criminal. For example, a fraudulent miller might be made to wear a pig's snout, a gossip a duck's beak. Hair cutting or beard shaving, especially for men, beard and hair were symbols of honor in that period. Cutting a male criminal's hair or beard meant his humiliation in society. Shame punishments functioned not only as a punishment tool but also as a mechanism to protect social order and moral values in medieval societies. These punishments left deep and lasting effects on criminals by targeting their most valuable asset, their reputation, alongside physical pain, maiming, and physical mutilation. In the Middle Ages, justice sometimes manifested through permanent marks engraved on the criminal's body. As they say, you paid the price for your crime. In that era, this saying had a much more concrete and cruel counterpart. A thief's hand would be cut off, a traitor's tongue removed, or a liar's eye gouged out. These punishments not only inflicted physical pain but also permanently branded the criminal within society, ostracized them, and presented a terrifying warning to potential criminals. These interventions on bodily integrity clearly showed how cruel a face the law of that period could have. Among medieval punishment methods, practices involving direct intervention on the criminal's bodily integrity held an important place. Such punishments were based on principles of deterrence and retaliation, ensuring the criminal paid the price for their deed physically. Usually, the organ directly related to the crime was targeted to increase the exemplary nature of the punishment. Aims of bodily mutilation punishments. Specific deterrence, aim to prevent the criminal from committing the same crime again by making them lose the organ they used to commit or that encouraged the crime. For example, cutting off a thief's hand physically hindered them from stealing again. General deterrence, such punishments, displayed in public executions, instilled fear in other potential criminals. A severed hand or a gouged eye was a concrete warning of how severe the consequences of crime could be. Lesson and branding, permanent marks left on the body made the criminal easily recognizable in society, branding them for life. This situation completely destroyed the criminal's reputation and led to social exclusion. Society thus engraved both the crime and the criminal into its memory. Retaliation and sense of justice, the an eye for an eye principle was another reason underlying these punishments. The criminal's bodily harm satisfied the victim's and society's sense of justice. Common application forms. Branding, marking one of the most frequent bodily mutilation punishments. A letter or symbol representing the crime, e.g., T for thief, M for murderer, was burned onto the criminal's face, forehead, hand, or arm with a hot iron. This mark lasted a lifetime and made the criminal tainted in society. Organ amputation/maiming. Hand cutting, the most common punishment for theft. Cutting a thief's hand from the wrist or fingers served both as physical punishment and social branding. Ear/nose cutting could be applied to people who lied, slandered, or committed petty thefts. Such mutilations made the criminal recognizable and damaged their reputation. Tongue cutting, used especially for verbal crimes like blasphemy, sedition, or religious heresy. It was believed, or hoped, that a person whose tongue was cut would not speak or commit such crimes again. Eye gouging, a punishment applied rarely, for crimes like treason, rebellion, or severe crimes. Blinding the victim both functionally disabled them and deepened the pain by taking away one of the most basic senses. Castration, one of the heaviest physical punishments applied for sexual crimes or male slaves who led rebellions. These punishments were often carried out in public places with great ceremony. Displaying pain and terror in this way left deep marks in the collective memory. These interventions on bodily integrity were the most striking practices, revealing the rigid, cruel, and often disproportionate nature of medieval law. It was a period where criminals could lose not only their lives but also their bodies and honor. Religious crimes and their punishments, blasphemy, heresy, and apostasy. In the Middle Ages, the power of the church was even greater than that of kings. Given this, crimes against God, religious crimes, were seen as the most unforgivable sins. As they say, fear God. This fear also formed the basis of law in that era. Blaspheming, deviating from church doctrine, or converting religions, these were not simple mistakes. They could condemn your soul to hell and your body to the world's most terrible punishments. Because violating God's law in the Middle Ages meant threatening the entire society. In medieval Europe, the absolute influence of the Catholic Church on political, social, and cultural life deeply affected the legal system. Alongside secular laws, canon law also held an important place, and religious crimes were among the acts punished with the heaviest penalties. In many societies, a sin against God was seen as a crime threatening the entire social order and moral fabric. Major religious crimes and their perceptions. Heresy, any belief or view deviating from or opposing the Church's official doctrines, was considered heresy. Groups like Cathars, Waldensians, and Lollards became targets of the Inquisition courts under accusations of heresy. Heresy was the most serious religious crime because it directly endangered the salvation of the soul and corrupted society. Blasphemy, speaking disrespectfully against God, Jesus, Mary, or saints, cursing, or insulting religious values was considered blasphemy. Although often a verbal crime, it was seen as a direct attack on social order and church authority. Apostasy, abandoning the Christian faith to convert to another religion or believing in no religion, was among the heaviest religious crimes. Conversion to Muslim or Jewish faith, in particular, was perceived as a great betrayal. Sorcery and witchcraft, being accused of collaborating with the devil, practicing magic, or being a witch, were religious-based accusations. These crimes were often seen as a satanic conspiracy against church authority and led to witch hunts reaching terrible proportions. Simony, the crime of selling church offices or sacred items for money. Although considered corruption within the church, it was seen as religious immorality. Usury, since charging interest was considered a sin in Christianity, this was also evaluated as a religious crime. Applied punishments, punishments for religious crimes could generally be even heavier and more cruel than those for secular crimes because it was believed these crimes endangered not only the body but also the soul. Penance and sacred duties, for milder heresy or first-time offenses, the accused might be forced to do public penance in church, go on a pilgrimage, or make certain donations. Excommunication, one of the church's strongest punishments. An excommunicated person was deprived of church services, ceremonies, and sacraments, ostracized from society, and considered almost like a living dead. This meant social and economic disaster in medieval society. Imprisonment and confiscation, those convicted of religious crimes could be sentenced to life or long-term imprisonment in church dungeons, and their property confiscated. Burning at the stake, the most horrific punishment applied for the heaviest religious crimes like heresy, witchcraft, or apostasy. These executions were usually carried out by secular authorities on the church's order, done in public squares as a lesson, avoiding bloodshed by the church. It carried religious symbolism like purification by fire and cleansing of the soul. The Inquisition courts played a key role in the pursuit and punishment of these religious crimes. Secret investigations, extracting confessions through torture, and merciless executions became a way for the church to consolidate its religious authority. Religious crimes and their punishments in the Middle Ages clearly show the deep religiosity of the period and how this religiosity could be used as a tool for social control. Excommunication, the Church's ultimate weapon. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was the center of social, political, and religious life in Europe. Even kings and nobles derived their religious legitimacy from the Church. This powerful position gave the Church a control power that even secular governments could not reach. Excommunication, these spiritual punishments were the most devastating weapons in the Church's arsenal, capable of targeting not only individuals but sometimes entire communities, even kings and emperors. What is excommunication and why was it feared? Excommunication meant the formal exclusion of a person from the Catholic Church community, i.e., the Christian congregation. An excommunicated person could not participate in the Church's holy rites, receive sacraments, like baptism, communion, confession, and could not be buried within the Church. Most importantly, according to the widespread belief of the time, the soul of an excommunicated person could not be saved, and it was thought they would go directly to hell upon death. For a devout medieval person, this was a punishment more frightening than death itself. The secular consequences of excommunication were also terrible. Social exclusion, an excommunicated person lost their reputation in society, was ostracized, and usually no one wanted to trade or speak with them. Social isolation could even make survival difficult. Legal exclusion, the testimony of an excommunicated person was not accepted. They could not seek their rights in courts, and could not even collect debts. Their official agreements and oaths were considered invalid. Loss of political power, if a king or noble was excommunicated, it was accepted that their subjects' obligation to obey them was lifted. This could trigger rebellions and completely shake the legitimacy of their rule. Causes for excommunication, reasons generally included heresy, disobedience to church laws, defiance of papal orders, failure to pay church taxes, seizure of church properties, and grave sins like blasphemy, adultery, murder, especially if not repented. Also political violations, like kings opposing the church's political authority or papal decisions. Interdict, excommunicating an entire region. A broader and more destructive form of excommunication was the interdict. In this case, the Church deprived not just an individual, but the entire population of a specific geographical area, of religious rights. Church doors closed, bells did not ring, and basic religious services like baptisms, marriages, or funerals were halted. The populace would panic greatly because their soul's salvation was threatened. This usually caused the people to revolt against their own rulers and force them to comply with the Church's demands. In history, some powerful kings, like King John of England and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, were excommunicated by the papacy, which brought them to the brink of losing their thrones. For example, Henry IV's excommunication by Pope Gregory VII in 1077 and his barefoot walk to Canossa to beg for forgiveness is one of the most striking examples of the Church's power over secular authority. Excommunication and interdict are proof of the immense psychological, social, and political pressure the Church exerted on both individuals and rulers in the Middle Ages. These spiritual punishments were the most effective ways of ensuring social control through fear and faith. Beating and flogging, corporal punishment as a deterrent. In the Middle Ages, punishments given to criminals mostly centered on physical pain. As they say, a friend tells you the painful truth, an enemy inflicts pain. In that era, the legal system seemed to apply the pain inflicted on an enemy to the criminal. Beating and flogging were not just punishments but also lessons engraved on the criminal's body and soul. These methods aimed both to make the criminal pay a price for the crime committed and to present an exemplary spectacle to society. In medieval law, physically punishing the criminal was a fundamental part of justice. Beating and flogging were the most common and frequently used corporal punishment methods. Although not as severe as death or maiming, these punishments inflicted great pain on the criminal and ensured their humiliation before the community. The aim was both to reform the criminal and deter others from crime. Aims of beating and flogging. Deterrence and exemplary lesson. These punishments were usually applied in public areas, city squares, or streets. Flogging and beating sessions done before crowds served as a direct warning to potential criminals. The physical aspect of the punishment and the agony suffered by the criminal showed observers how severe the consequences of crime could be. This was a concrete example of using fear as a tool to maintain social order. Penance and purification. According to Christian belief, suffering bodily pain could help a person atone for their sins and repent. Flogging was sometimes applied after a confession or as a punishment for a religious crime, seen as a means for spiritual cleansing. Revenge and sense of justice satisfied the feelings of revenge and justice felt by society or the victim against the criminal. The marks and pain left on the criminal's body created the perception that the price for the committed act had been paid. Display of authority. The application of punishments also reinforced the absolute authority and power of the ruler, local lord, or church. The public, watching these executions, understood how determined and ruthless the rulers could be. Application methods. Beating and flogging could be applied with different levels of severity and various tools. Whip, flog, the most commonly used tool. Leather straps, sometimes whips with metal bits, bone, or glass fragments at the end, were used. Whiplashes were struck on the criminal's back or naked body, leaving deep wounds and painful marks. Caning/bastonado, hitting the soles of the criminal's feet or other parts of their body with a stick. Especially hitting the soles inflicted extreme pain and could cripple the criminal by making walking difficult. Beating with chains. In some cases, criminals were punished by being beaten with heavy chains. Beating with hard objects. Beating the criminal with various iron rods, stones, or wood pieces was among the applied methods. These punishments were usually displayed before the public. The criminal would be tied to a post with hands bound or thrown into the midst of the crowd, then beaten by the executioner. Flogging and beating sessions could sometimes last for hours and could even lead to the victim's death. The screams and pain of the criminal served as an unforgettable lesson for the observers. Beating and flogging are practices that clearly reveal the cruelty of medieval law and the central role bodily pain played in social control and the pursuit of justice. The role of confession and its extraction. In the Middle Ages, when a crime was committed, there were no fingerprints, DNA tests, or camera recordings like today. As they say, words fly away, writing remains. But in that period, often the only writing, the only concrete evidence, was the confession from the criminal's own mouth. So how was this confession obtained? Usually through methods that constitute the darkest pages of human history, torture. This situation reveals how easily justice could go astray and the bitter truth that even innocent people had to confess to things they didn't do to save themselves. In medieval legal systems, detecting and proving crimes was far from the methods of the modern age. Due to the absence of scientific evidence and underdeveloped investigation techniques, confession was accepted as the strongest, and often the only, way to prove a criminal's guilt. This compelled the judges, secular courts or the Inquisition, to resort to various, often cruel, methods to obtain confessions. Foremost among these methods was torture. The role and place of torture in trials. Torture was a legal and acceptable tool for obtaining confessions in the Middle Ages. Especially from the 13th century onwards, it became widespread, first in church law for serious crimes like heresy, then in secular courts for crimes like murder and treason. The legal theory of torture was this: a person thought to be guilty would tell the truth only under unbearable pain. The value of confession was so high that it was often accepted as direct proof of guilt. Forced confession aimed to force the accused to confess to committing the crime or to reveal accomplices. This was usually done by pushing the victim to the limits of their physical and psychological endurance. Insufficiency of evidence: when witness statements or circumstantial evidence were deemed insufficient, torture functioned as the ultimate proof. Witness testimonies: torture was used not only on the accused but sometimes also on witnesses to obtain truthful statements. The reliability of confessions obtained under torture. The use of torture as an interrogation method created serious problems regarding the reliability of confessions. False confessions: the biggest problem was that even innocent people, under the unbearable pain of torture, would confess to things they didn't do to save themselves. Many would accept the stories imposed on them just to stop the pain. False information and implicating others: torture sometimes led the criminal to accuse others, friends, relatives, triggering chain reactions that caused innocent people to be tortured or punished. Psychological effect: the psychology of a tortured person would be completely broken. They could become unable to distinguish reality from imagination. In this state, it was impossible for the statements given to be sound. Legal contradiction: whether a confession under torture was voluntary was a topic debated even among jurists of the period. Some judges required that the confession made after torture be repeated by the accused after the torture ended. However, the accused might still continue their confession for fear of the torture being repeated. Torture methods used: as mentioned in previous topics, many instruments and methods like the rack, Spanish boot, head crusher, and water torture were used. These instruments aimed not only to inflict unbearable physical pain but also to psychologically break the victim. The goal was to render the accused completely will-less and obtain the desired confession. These practices of the Middle Ages represent the dark side of justice and are one of the reasons for the emergence of fundamental principles absolutely prohibiting torture in modern legal systems today. This cruel relationship between crime detection and confession reliability is one of the most controversial and tragic aspects of the medieval understanding of law. Trials by ordeal and combat, divine judgment and duels. In the Middle Ages, if you were accused of a crime, your fate wasn't in the hands of a judge or prosecutor like we know. Sometimes everything was left to God's decision, other times, it was determined by a duel where swords and shields spoke directly. As they say, the best defense is a good offense. In that era, this saying was valid in the literal sense. The legal system relied more on faith and physical strength than reason and evidence. This made trial processes both strange and extremely dangerous. Throughout the Middle Ages, contrary to today's advanced legal systems, different, often mystical and physical methods were resorted to for trying criminals and determining innocence or guilt. Due to the lack of scientific evidence and underdeveloped investigation techniques, justice was based on divine intervention or physical strength. Ordeals, trials by ordeal, the search for divine decision. Ordeals were tests where divine providence was appealed to determine if a person was guilty. The widespread belief that God would protect the innocent and expose the guilty lay at the heart of these methods. These trials, which became widespread under the influence of the Church, were extremely dangerous and often fatal for the accused. Ordeal of hot iron: the accused had to carry a piece of iron heated to red hot with their bare hands for a certain distance. Then their hands were bandaged and checked after 3 days. If the wound was infected or not healed, it was taken as a sign that God found the accused guilty. If it had begun to heal, they were considered innocent. Ordeal of hot water, the accused had to retrieve a stone or metal piece dipped in boiling water. Similarly, the condition of the burns determined their innocence. Ordeal of cold water, used especially in accusations of witchcraft and heresy. The accused, with hands and feet bound, was thrown into water. If they sank, they were innocent, the water had accepted them. If they floated, they were considered guilty, the water had rejected them. Ordeal of the blessed morsel, usually applied among clergy, the accused was expected to swallow a consecrated morsel without choking. A person who couldn't swallow or choked was found guilty. These methods, viewed from today's perspective, seem irrational and cruel, but for the people of that era, they were accepted as the manifestation of divine justice. However, in these trials, a person's physical endurance or luck factor could be decisive instead of their innocence. Trial by combat, judicial duel, justice where weapons speak. Another method resorted to, especially among nobles and in serious accusations, like murder, treason, insult, was trial by combat. In this method, a duel, usually fought with sword and shield, took place between the accused and the accuser, or their representatives who fought in their place. God's verdict: it was believed that the side winning the duel was right because God would grant victory to the righteous side. This was a system where strength and skill were accepted as indicators of justice. Severe consequences: the losing side was considered to have committed the crime and was often executed or given heavy punishments. A matter of honor, trial by combat was a matter of reputation for the noble class, where honor and prestige were of great importance. Legal process: duels took place within certain rules and rituals. The parties would swear an oath before the duel and resort to this path with the court's permission. These trial processes were products of an era where elements like evidence gathering, witness statements, and lawyer defense, present in modern law, had not developed. Along with confessions extracted under torture, ordeals and duels lay bare how interesting, cruel, and often unpredictable the structure of medieval justice was. Execution methods: the final punishment. In the Middle Ages, the end of a crime was usually death, but not a uniform, quick death. As they say, fate weaves its webs. Those webs sometimes took you to the gallows, sometimes to a pile of wood, sometimes under the executioner's sharp sword. This was not just an execution but also a public spectacle, the highest display of authority, and the final lesson given to the criminal. Executions didn't just take lives, they also engraved fear into society's memory. Throughout the Middle Ages, the death penalty was the ultimate punishment applied for the most serious crimes. However, these penalties were not limited to a single method as today. The justice understanding of the period developed various, often cruel, execution methods that differed according to the type of crime, the criminal's social status, and even the purpose of the execution. These executions were usually carried out publicly, thus both providing deterrence and giving a message that social order was maintained. Main execution methods. 1. Hanging. Usage area: the most common execution method for various crimes like theft, murder. Especially frequently used for commoners or non-noble criminals. Application: the criminal was hanged by a rope from a gallows, left to die by strangulation or neck breaking. Executions took place in city squares or by main roads. Social function: hanging corpses were displayed for days, even weeks, giving a lesson to passers-by. It reminded them of the severe consequences of crime. This aimed to intimidate society and reduce crime rates. 2. Burning at the stake. Usage area, especially applied for religious crimes, heresy, witchcraft, apostasy. Sometimes also used for heavy political crimes like treason. Application, the criminal was usually tied to a stake amidst dry wood piles and burned alive. Death occurred slowly and painfully from burning or smoke inhalation. Social function, burning had religious symbolism like purification of both body and soul and destruction of evil. Public burning ceremonies were a terrifying warning showing the absolute authority of the church and how ruthless it could be against those who strayed from the faith. 3. Beheading, by guillotine or sword. Usage area, generally reserved for nobles, high-ranking individuals, or certain heavy crimes. Considered a more honorable death compared to other methods because the victim's pain was shorter. Application, the executioner separated the victim's head from their body with a single stroke using a sharp sword or axe. Mechanical devices like the guillotine emerged more in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. Social function, beheading was also done publicly. Displaying the criminal's head on a spike was a common practice. This method gave a message to society by showing the authorities' ability to punish even the most powerful individuals. Other, rarer, and more cruel methods. Drawing and quartering, one of the most horrific methods, especially applied for crimes like treason. The victim was dismembered while alive by being tied to horses by the limbs or with special tools. These executions were known for their extreme cruelty. Strangulation and hanging, in some regions, strangulation, considered an honorable death for nobles but still painful, was applied. Stoning, a method where the victim was stoned to death, applied for some religious crimes or acts against social norms like adultery. The variety of these execution methods clearly reveals how medieval justice functioned not only as punishment but also as tools for exemplary lessons, fear, and display of authority. The value of human life was perceived very differently compared to the modern period, and bodily pain and death were fundamental tools in maintaining social order. Lex talionis, an eye for an eye. In the Middle Ages, justice didn't bother with suitable rehabilitation or anything like that for the criminal as it does today. As they say, you reap what you sow. In that era, this saying had a much harsher and more direct counterpart, lex talionis, retaliation. If you harmed someone, you would be harmed in the same way. If you took out an eye, you would lose your own. This was not just a quest for revenge but also the result of a deep belief that justice was a matter of divine and social balance. The price of the crime was paid directly and painfully. In medieval law, one of the most fundamental philosophies defining the relationship between crime and punishment was the principle of lex talionis, known as retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This principle, inherited from the Old Testament, the Torah, and ancient legal systems, like the Code of Hammurabi, was seen as the earthly reflection of divine justice. Its purpose was to administer justice and restore social balance by applying a punishment that exactly matched the nature of the crime and the harm suffered by the victim. Foundations and aims of lex talionis. Religious and moral justification. The principle of retaliation was seen as a reflection of God's justice. The belief was that when a wrong was committed, the divine balance was disrupted, and to restore it, the criminal had to suffer a pain or loss similar to that of the victim. This was also interpreted as the criminal paying the price for their sin. Deterrence. The threat of subjecting the criminal to the exact same act they committed created an extremely powerful deterrent effect on potential criminals. People could directly imagine the possible physical consequences of their own actions. Social satisfaction and sense of revenge. Retaliation satisfied the quest for revenge and sense of justice felt by crime victims and society at large. The punishment given to the criminal was seen as a response to the victim's suffering. This quelled social anger and reinforced the perception that order had been restored. Simplicity and comprehensibility. In an era devoid of complex legal theories, the principle of retaliation was quite simple and understandable. Everyone could easily grasp what the punishment for a specific crime would be. Applied examples of the retaliation principle. Retaliation was applied in various forms for different crimes in the Middle Ages. Crimes against bodily integrity. Gouging out the eye of someone who had gouged out another's eye. Cutting off the hand of someone who had cut off another's hand, especially common in theft. Cutting out the tongue of someone who slandered or insulted. Subjecting someone who caused a disability to the same disability. Theft. For petty theft, hand or finger amputation was common, while for larger thefts, repayment of the stolen goods value or the death penalty could be applied. Murder. Murderers were generally executed. This was the most direct application of the life for a life principle. Sometimes there were symbolic practices, like delivering the criminal's body to the victim's funeral or family. Arson. Punishments like burning the arsonists themselves were conceivable, but such direct applications were rare. Burning was more commonly used for religious crimes. Limitations and evolution of retaliation. Although the retaliation principle may seem rigid, in medieval law, there could be flexibilities or variations in practice under certain circumstances. Social status. Retaliation could differ between nobles and commoners. The punishment for a crime committed by a noble could be different from that given to a peasant for the same crime. Financial compensation. Weregild. In some legal systems, particularly Germanic law, there could be an option to pay financial compensation instead of retaliation. The criminal could avoid punishment by paying a certain amount of money or goods. This was a method used especially to prevent blood feuds. The Church's influence. The Church sometimes tried to soften the excessively cruel applications of retaliation. However, the retaliation principle generally remained strong. The philosophy of lex talionis was a powerful, simple, and ruthless understanding of justice that formed the basis of medieval law. It deeply influenced the social structure, beliefs, and perspective on crime and punishment of that era. Double standards in justice. Nobles versus commoners. In the Middle Ages, justice did not work the same for everyone. As they say, the rich man's wealth tires the poor man's jaw. In that era, being rich and noble introduced you to a completely different face of the justice system. While a peasant might go to the gallows for a tiny theft, a noble could get away much more lightly for the same crime. Although laws were written for everyone, the color of their application changed according to the color of the criminal's clothing. The scales of justice, unfortunately, did not always weigh equally. Medieval societies had a rigid hierarchical structure. Society was divided into different classes like kings, nobles, clergy, free peasants, and serfs. This class distinction deeply affected not only social and economic life but also the application of justice and the punishments given to criminals. Justice often showed two different faces for noble criminals and common criminals. Privileges and punishments of nobles. The noble class had many social and legal privileges. Their blood and honor were considered far more valuable than that of a commoner. This led to them receiving special treatment even when they committed crimes. Lighter or symbolic punishments. Crimes committed by nobles, especially if against a commoner, could often be brushed aside with lighter punishments. Even in serious crimes, options like financial compensation, ransom, fines, exile, or imprisonment were more frequently preferred over the death penalty. Honorable execution methods: if a noble was sentenced to death, they were usually executed by a method considered more honorable than the painful and humiliating ones applied to common criminals: hanging, burning, dismemberment. Beheading was a relatively quicker death and shortened the victim's pain. Special courts: nobles were usually tried in special courts judged by their peers. This increased their chances of a fairer or more favorable trial process. Papal and royal pardons: nobles also had the chance to use their political and religious connections to obtain a pardon from the Pope or the king. Punishments suffered by the common people, peasants and serfs. The common people, who made up the vast majority of society, were much more vulnerable in legal processes and punishments. Justice for them was generally far more cruel and disproportionate. Heavy and cruel punishments: for crimes like theft, minor rebellions, or blasphemy, commoners could receive severe punishments like hanging, maiming, hand amputation, eye gouging, branding, or flogging. The aim of these punishments was to both physically punish the criminal and deter others. Public and humiliating executions: executions of common criminals were usually carried out as grand spectacles in the most crowded areas like marketplaces. Corpses were left on gallows for days to be displayed as a lesson. This humiliating treatment completely destroyed the criminals and their families' reputation. Torture to extract confessions: in cases of insufficient evidence, the method of extracting confessions through torture was used more widely and ruthlessly against common people. Unlike nobles, they had no powerful lobby or connections to protect them. Legal defenselessness: common people often had no knowledge of legal processes and lacked the means to defend themselves, such as hiring a lawyer. This increased their risk of being unjustly accused and punished. This double-standard justice understanding in the Middle Ages was a reflection of the socio-political structure of the period. The law not only maintained order but also reinforced the existing class structure and the privileged position of the nobility. While a noble acted with the immunity brought by their blood and status, for a commoner, even the smallest mistake could turn into an irreparable tragedy. This situation clearly shows how unjust and class-based the legal system of the Middle Ages was. Child criminals: innocence has no age. In the Middle Ages, the justice system against children who committed crimes didn't bother much with principles like the best interests of the child, as we do today. As they say, sins committed at a young age call for greater sins. In that era, crime didn't really have an age for children either. Their punishment, like an adult, was just a matter of time. But there were still some minor differences. Society's harsh realities didn't seem to recognize innocence much. In medieval law, punishing child criminals was a more complex topic that varied from region to region compared to adults. Generally, there was no separate juvenile justice system as in modern law. Children above a certain age could be subject to the same laws as adults and could even receive the same severe punishments. However, it is also seen that age and the nature of the crime sometimes led to different treatment. The importance of age and criminal responsibility. In the Middle Ages, whether a child had criminal responsibility was usually determined based on the religious and legal age of reason. This age was less a specific number and more a period when the child was considered capable of distinguishing good from evil. Under 7 years old, according to the generally accepted understanding, children under 7 were not considered capable of committing crimes. Their actions were not evaluated like those of adults, and they were generally not punished. This age limit was also significant in canon law. Children under this age were not considered fully responsible for sin. Between 7 and 14 years old, this age group was in a gray area. If a child was over 7 but under 14, the court or judge would consider the child's level of maturity at the time of the crime and its seriousness. It would be questioned whether the child understood the crime and acted of their own will. In some cases, these children could be punished like adults, while in others, lighter punishments or penance imposed by the church were used. Efforts were made to prove the child knew evil or acted with devilish impulses. Over 14 years old, children aged 14 and over were generally treated the same as adults. An individual of this age was considered to have the maturity to understand the consequences of their crime. Therefore, their hand could be cut off for theft, they could be executed for murder, or burned for a religious crime. Applied punishments. Punishments for child criminals could generally be lighter versions of those applied to adults or directly the same. Physical punishments, flogging, beating, or caning were common physical punishments for child criminals. These punishments were both painful and had a humiliating effect in public. Shame punishments, being displayed to the public tied to shame instruments like the pillory or foot stocks, was a method applied to child criminals. This damaged their social reputation. Fines and bodily compensation. If the child's family was financially well off, options like fines or compensation to the victim could be offered. Severe punishments for serious crimes. For very serious crimes like murder, treason, or major theft, children over 14 could be given the same heavy punishments applied to adults, such as execution or maiming. Historical records contain examples of children going to the gallows at a young age. The Church's influence. Because the Church focused more on the spiritual salvation of child criminals, it could sometimes show a softer approach compared to secular courts. Religious punishments like penance, fasting, pilgrimage, or religious education could be given to children. However, in religious-based accusations like heresy or witchcraft, the age factor could be less effective, and the Church could also ruthlessly judge a child deemed guilty. The punishment of child criminals in the Middle Ages shows the harsh realities of the period and that the law did not exhibit a sensitive approach to the concept of childhood as in the modern age. Once a child was accepted as having reason and will, the face of justice for them could become as cruel as it was for adults. Torturers and executioners, the dark faces of justice. Behind the dark curtain of medieval justice, there were figures whose very existence sent shivers down one's spine. As they say, the law is a sharp blade, its point can turn on you too. They were the hands that held that blade. Torturers and executioners were not just officials, they were also concrete symbols of fear, pain, and absolute power. They were the executors of justice, applying the law's most ruthless face, sometimes ostracized by society but at the same time respected and feared. In medieval legal systems, torturers and executioners played key roles in the process of determining guilt and executing punishment. These figures were people both feared and ostracized by society, yet indispensable to the justice mechanism. Their existence embodied the absolute authority of the state or the Church and how ruthless that authority could be if necessary. The role of the torturer. The torturer was a special official tasked by courts to determine guilt or obtain confessions. Especially in Inquisition courts and secular authority courts, torturers used various methods to extract the truth from the accused. Tasked with obtaining confessions, the torturer's primary duty was to force the accused to confess to the crime by inflicting pain through torture instruments. Since confession was considered the strongest proof in that era, the torturer's role was vital. Psychological pressure. The torturer was not just an implementer of physical pain but also a figure who created psychological pressure on the victim. Their mere presence and the threat of the pain they would inflict were enough to make many accused confess. Social ostracism. Due to the nature of their profession, torturers were generally ostracized and feared by other segments of society. Their profession was seen as dirty or disgusting. The role of the executioner. The executioner, hangman, or headsman was the person who carried out the death sentences or severe bodily punishments, maiming, flogging, given by the court. The profession of executioner was usually hereditary, passed from father to son, and required special training and endurance. Implementer of the executioner was the sole authorized person who carried out executions like hanging, beheading, burning, and dismembering. With his sword, axe, rope, or other execution tools, he performed his duty. The end of the legal process. The executioner was the final link in the legal process. By physically implementing the court's decision, he ensured justice was served. Public spectacle. Since many executions were performed in public squares before large crowds, the executioner was also the lead actor in this terrifying show. His presence and actions served as a cautionary lesson to the public, showing how heavy the price of crime was. Dual perception. Like torturers, executioners were figures both ostracized and feared in society. In some places, special neighborhoods were allocated for them, and direct contact with them was avoided. However, they also had a status of mixed respect and fear because they maintained order. Some executioners, in addition to the dirty income brought by their profession, made a living by doing small jobs among the people, animal slaughter, or surgical-like interventions. Special knowledge and skill. Executions often had to be carried out with a single blow or with minimal pain for the executioner to be considered professional. This required executioners to have knowledge of anatomy and physical skill. Both torturers and executioners were the dark but indispensable elements within the medieval justice system. They were figures who embodied the ruthless face of the period's justice understanding, trying to maintain social order through the tool of fear and violence. These figures also showed that justice was not just an abstract concept but also a concrete power applied on the human body. Law codes and written sources. The medieval legal system, unlike today's uniform, codified systems, had a complex and layered structure fed from numerous different sources. Laws and legal practices were generally transmitted from generation to generation through written texts and evolved over time. These law books and codes were the fundamental reference points shaping medieval justice. Primary sources of legal texts. The legacy of Roman law, Corpus Juris Civilis. Although its influence decreased in Europe with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, from the 11th century onwards, Roman law began to be rediscovered and studied at centers like the University of Bologna in Italy. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled by Emperor Justinian, with its rational and systematic structure, deeply influenced medieval jurists. These texts formed the basis of legal education in universities, especially in continental Europe, and became a source of inspiration for drafting new laws. The influence of Roman law was particularly evident in areas like commercial law and property rights. Germanic law and traditional laws. In many regions of Europe, especially lands settled by Germanic tribes, Germanic law was valid. This law was based more on oral traditions, customs, and customary law rather than being written. However, over time, these traditions were also put into writing. For example, texts like the Salic law, Lex Salica, contained the criminal and civil provisions of Germanic societies. These laws were generally based on tribal bonds, blood feuds, and financial compensations were guild. Canon law, church law. The absolute influence of the Catholic Church on political and social life led to the development of its own legal system, canon law. Papal decrees, council decisions, and the writings of the Church Fathers formed the basis of this law. Canon law regulated religious crimes, heresy, blasphemy, marriage, inheritance, and church property. Works like Gratian's Decretum Gratiani played a significant role in compiling canon law. Inquisition courts judged according to canon law. Feudal law. The feudal structure of the Middle Ages brought with it the legal authority of landowners, lords, over their own lands. Feudal law, often unwritten or shaped by the decisions of the local lord, regulated relations between lord and vassal, land ownership, and local justice. Town/city law, burgh law. With the growth of cities, special city law systems emerged regulating the commercial and social lives of city dwellers. These laws covered guilds, marketplaces, taxes, and intra-city crimes. They had their own courts and judges. Law books and compilations. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, especially with the increasing complexity of law, various law books and legal compilations gained importance. Customary law compilations, which put local customs and traditions into writing, were important guides in the application of justice. Royal and imperial codes. Kings and emperators issued various codes, e.g., Magna Carta in England, royal ordinances in France, to consolidate their authority and create a centralized legal system. Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, books. In the Islamic world, throughout the Middle Ages, comprehensive fiqh books containing the views of various schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, based on Sharia law, and court records compiling judges' decisions, formed the basis of justice. These texts offered a broad legal framework covering both religious and worldly matters. These diverse legal texts and laws created the complex legal landscape of medieval societies. Justice was in constant interaction between different authorities, different traditions, and different written sources. Dungeons and prisons, places of waiting and fear. In the Middle Ages, perhaps one of the greatest fears upon being accused of a crime was being thrown into a place that saw no sunlight, smelled of damp, and was cold with stone walls. As they say, to fall into a dungeon. In that era, this phrase literally expressed a horror. But were these dungeons like the prisons we understand today? Or were they just a waiting room until the moment their fate was decided? This was not just a place surrounded by walls. It was also the beginning of despair, darkness, and often an end. Throughout the Middle Ages, dungeons and prisons had a function quite different from modern penal institutions. They were generally not used as long-term rehabilitation or imprisonment centers as they are today. They functioned more as transitional stops where the accused were held before trial or awaited the execution of their sentences. However, in some cases, and especially under the influence of religious courts, these places could also become punishment sites in their own right. The basic function of dungeons, transitional stops. Medieval dungeons were mostly part of castles, manor houses, monasteries, or city walls. Their basic functions were custody and detention, used to prevent a person accused of a crime from escaping until the trial process was completed. During this time, the accused were usually held in poor conditions with limited food and water. Awaiting ransom, especially places where people who could be freed for ransom, like nobles or wealthy merchants, were held until payment was made. Awaiting execution, Places where criminals sentenced to death or receiving heavy punishments like maiming were held until the day their execution was to be carried out. This period could sometimes last days or weeks. Torture chamber. Many dungeons were also used as torture chambers. Various torture instruments designed to extract confessions from the accused were located in these spaces. The conditions in these dungeons were generally horrifying, dark, damp, cold, filthy, and often overcrowded. Due to lack of proper ventilation or sanitation, diseases spread rapidly. Many prisoners lost their lives due to these poor conditions before awaiting trial or punishment. The development of prisons as punishment sites. Although their primary function was as a transitional stop, towards the end of the Middle Ages and especially into the early modern period, prisons began to be used as punishment sites. The influence of the church and punishments given for certain religious crimes played a significant role in this development. Church and monastery prisons. The church held religious criminals, heretics, and rebellious priests in its own prisons or in the isolation cells of monasteries for them to repent and cleanse themselves of sin. Such prisons were sometimes used for punishments involving restrictions like solitary confinement and fasting, which could last a lifetime. The aim was the person's spiritual recovery, but conditions were still harsh. Debtors' prisons. In some cities, there were special prisons for people who couldn't pay their debts. These individuals were held there until their debts were paid or an agreement was reached. The beginning of reform and rehabilitation thought, especially from the 16th century onwards, under the influence of some humanist thinkers and the Protestant Reformation, the idea began to emerge that prisons could be not only a place of detention but also a place where criminals were reformed. However, these ideas would only be implemented in a real sense in much later centuries. Social perception. In medieval society, dungeons were associated with fear and horror. Falling into one was often seen as the beginning of the end. Prison guards and dungeon officials were generally perceived as cruel and corrupt. The survival of prisoners usually depended on support from outside, family or friends providing food and money. In short, the concept of dungeon and prison in the Middle Ages was very different from today's system. These places were less prisons and more waiting or isolation places under terrible conditions. The real punishment was usually the executions, maimings, or shame practices carried out outside these walls, in front of the public. Appeal and pardon mechanisms, a glimmer of hope. In that harsh and often ruthless medieval justice system, once found guilty, one's fate seemed sealed. As they say, to bow to fate. In that era, most people could find no other recourse but to do that. However, even if rarely, some doors were slightly ajar to appeal the decision or beg for pardon. These doors, however weak, showed that justice was not entirely a one-way street and that hope could sometimes shine even in the darkest dungeon. Medieval legal systems did not have the developed appeal and review mechanisms of today. Court decisions, especially those given by local lords or feudal lords, were often considered final. However, it was not a completely closed system. Under certain conditions, people found guilty had a chance to appeal decisions or be pardoned. Appeal mechanisms. Appeal was usually possible based on the claim that the decision was based on a legal error or that there was irregularity in the trial. However, these processes were quite difficult and often required having a certain status or connections. Appeal to higher courts. In some cases, it was possible to appeal directly to the king or royal courts against the decisions of local feudal or city courts. But this was generally more common in centralized kingdoms where the king's authority was strong, e.g., in England. These appeals were usually requests to annul the decision or for a retrial. Church court/papacy. For matters related to canon law, it was possible to appeal to the papacy or higher church courts against decisions given. The papacy was theoretically the highest judicial authority in Europe and could sometimes even influence secular court decisions. Appealing trial errors, the accused or their family could claim a violation of law during the trial, false testimony, or an improper evidence-gathering method, e.g., excessive torture. However, proving such claims was extremely difficult, and the burden of proof usually lay with the accused. Pardon mechanisms. Pardon generally meant the complete or partial removal of a convicted person's sentence. The authority to pardon usually resided with the highest authority, the king or the papacy. Royal pardon, the king's mercy/majesty rulers could use their discretionary power to pardon criminals under certain circumstances. This usually occurred on a holiday, during an important event, or when the ruler wanted to show mercy. Political reasons, sometimes, noble criminals could be pardoned due to political calculations or the influence of powerful families. In some cases, even an old enemy could be pardoned if it provided political benefit. In exchange for financial compensation, in some cases, heavy penalties like the death penalty could be commuted in exchange for a heavy fine or confiscation of property. Papal pardon, religious absolution. Popes could issue pardons for religious crimes, outside of heresy, or on certain days. Punishments could be mitigated in exchange for pilgrimage, donations to the church, or long-term penance. Indulgences, especially during the Crusades, documents for the remission of sins issued by the church could sometimes be associated with the mitigation of worldly punishments, though this was more of a religious pardon mechanism. Limitations and difficulties. Although appeal and pardon mechanisms existed in the Middle Ages, access to them was generally limited. Economic situation, trial costs and the money needed for appeals/pardons were almost impossible for the poor and ordinary people. Social status, nobles and those close to the church had a much greater advantage in using appeal and pardon mechanisms. Communication difficulties, due to limited transportation and communication possibilities, it was a major problem for prisoners in remote regions to reach the king or the papacy. Lack of evidence, especially refuting confessions obtained under torture later, was nearly impossible. These mechanisms showed that medieval justice was not an absolute darkness, but it was still far from today's principles of human rights and fair trial. Justice was generally ruthless and swift. But for those seeking a ray of hope, albeit rarely, some paths were open. Justice in times of rebellion and social unrest. The feudal structure, social inequalities, and heavy taxes of the Middle Ages frequently paved the way for uprisings and rebellions. Peasant revolts, city uprisings, or religious rebellions were among the greatest challenges to central authority and the existing order in medieval societies. In these periods of social turmoil, justice usually focused not on seeking rights and law, but on re-establishing authority and ruthlessly punishing the rebels. Causes and nature of uprisings. The main causes of medieval uprisings were generally economic pressure, heavy taxes, feudal obligations, famines, and epidemics, e.g., labor shortages after the Black Death, devastated the people economically. Social injustice, the privileges held by nobles and the church created a great sense of injustice among the people. Political dissatisfaction, poor governance by kings or local lords, wars, or dynastic conflicts could also trigger rebellions. Religious motivation, some uprisings could stem from accusations of religious heresy or dissatisfaction with the church. These uprisings were generally unorganized, spontaneous movements that spread with great violence. Their leaders were often charismatic but short-lived. Suppression of uprisings and punishments. Uprisings were usually suppressed bloodily. Central authority, king, emperor, or local lords, used their own armies to defeat the rebels. After the rebellion was crushed, the justice mechanism came into play, and the punishment of the rebels became the strongest message to be given to society. The aim of the punishments was not only to punish the criminals but also to completely deter any possible future rebellions. Therefore, punishments were usually extremely harsh and public. Mass executions, leaders and prominent figures of uprisings, when captured, were ruthlessly executed. Gallows, beheading sites, or burning stakes were used for these mass executions. Sometimes hundreds of rebels could be executed simultaneously, their corpses displayed for days. Dismemberment and limb amputation. Some rebels were given punishments that destroyed their bodily integrity. Their arms or legs could be cut off, eyes gouged out, or they could be branded. This punishment aimed both to torture and to serve as a lesson by permanently crippling the criminal. Accusation of treason. Those participating in rebellions were usually charged with treason. This was one of the heaviest crimes in the Middle Ages and brought with it the most horrific execution methods, e.g., drawing and quartering in England. Confiscation of property. Forfeiture. The property of rebels was confiscated, leaving their families in poverty. This both broke the economic power of the rebels and increased the authorities' power. Burning and destruction of cities/villages. Cities and villages where the uprising originated or was supported could be burned or destroyed as a collective punishment. This was a warning to the entire society, showing how devastating the consequences of rebellion could be. Excommunication and religious exclusion. In uprisings involving religious leaders, spiritual punishments like excommunication could also be applied by the church. The punishments applied during periods of social turmoil were an indicator of the effort of medieval states and the church to re-establish and maintain social order through the tool of fear and violence. The ruthless punishment of rebels reminded the public how powerful the authority was and how heavy the price of opposing it would be. This situation clearly reveals that medieval law resorted to rigid and oppressive methods rather than humane principles to ensure social stability. The evolution of justice and transition to modernity. The principle of lex talionis, punishments against bodily integrity, extracting confessions through torture, and public, ruthless executions that prevailed throughout the Middle Ages formed the basis of the period's legal system. However, from the late 15th century onwards, especially with the transition to the early modern period, the first steps began to be taken from these barbaric practices towards a more civilized understanding of justice. This evolution was a slow and gradual process influenced by various factors. Factors triggering the evolution. Renaissance and humanism. The human-centered thought brought by the Renaissance, humanism, began to emphasize the value and dignity of the individual. This philosophy gave rise to the idea that torture and cruel punishments were contrary to human dignity. These thoughts would consolidate further in the Age of Enlightenment. Strengthening of state authority. The strengthening of central kingdoms and states against feudal lordships allowed the justice system to acquire a more regular and centralized structure. Kings tried to reduce arbitrary practices by strengthening their own courts and judges. The rationalization of law was consolidating state power. Influence of Roman law. The re-examination and adoption of Roman law by jurists in universities contributed to the development of more systematic, evidence-based, and procedural trial principles. This paved the way for abandoning irrational methods like ordeals. Development of commerce and urban life. With the revitalization of trade and growth of cities, more complex economic relations emerged. This created the need to resolve commercial disputes and crimes with a more rational and predictable legal system. Guild rules and written city laws in cities encouraged more regular trials. Religious reform movements. The Protestant Reformation began to question the absolute authority of the Church. This led to a decrease in the power of the Inquisition and changes in punishments for religious crimes in some regions. First steps of evolution and changing practices. Abandonment of ordeals. From the 13th century, the Church began to condemn ordeals, e.g., hot iron or water ordeals, and call for their abandonment. These irrational methods gradually gave way to much more witness testimony and formal interrogations. Limitation of torture. Although torture did not completely disappear, its use was bound by stricter rules in some regions. It was stated that torture could only be used for certain crimes and under certain conditions. The validity of confessions obtained under torture began to be questioned, and more value was given to voluntary confessions. Rise of imprisonment. Prisons gradually began to be used as a means of punishment execution, not just as a transitional or custody place. Especially, long-term imprisonments in church prisons for religious criminals to repent were applied, and later secular states also began to adopt this method. This was seen as a more humane option than physically maiming or executing the criminal. More regular trial processes. Court records began to be kept. Legal procedures were standardized, and judges became more educated. The rise of professional lawyers and judges helped justice to be based on a more systematic foundation. Institutionalization of pardon and mercy mechanisms. Mechanisms like royal pardon became more pronounced, and the idea that mercy could be shown at the end of trial processes in some cases gained strength. These changes were the first steps on the long and difficult path from the ruthless justice system of the Middle Ages to the fundamental principles of modern criminal law. Although the transition to full civilization would take centuries, these first steps sowed the seeds of modern legal philosophy such as human rights, fair trial, and proportionality of punishments. The legacy of medieval justice, the foundation of modern law. We've talked about that darker justice system of the Middle Ages. You might say, thank goodness those days are behind us. But in fact, the foundation of the modern legal system we have today lies in very important lessons drawn from that period. Horrible tortures, ruthless executions, and double-standard trials showed us what was wrong and became milestones on the path to building a fairer world. The shadow of the past shaped today's light. When we look at the criminal law of the Middle Ages, we see how far it was from concepts like human rights or fair trial today. However, precisely these extreme and cruel practices played an indirect but very important role in shaping the fundamental principles of modern legal systems. The darker face of the Middle Ages is like a textbook that paved the way for the birth of the enlightened principles of today's law. Torture and the unreliability of confessions. The birth of the right to a fair trial. The frequent resort to torture for detecting crime in the Middle Ages left its greatest legacy, the absolute prohibition of torture and the removal of confession as the strongest proof. Countless false confessions and punishment of innocent people under torture led jurists and thinkers to conclude that this method produced not justice, but only pain. The right to remain silent. In modern law, the accused right to remain silent and the invalidation of evidence obtained through torture arose from these historical experiences. Presumption of innocence. The principle that a person is considered innocent until proven guilty is a reaction to the obligation to prove innocence instead of proving guilt in the Middle Ages. Public executions and punishments against bodily integrity. Human dignity and proportionality. Punishments like public hangings, burnings, and organ amputations in the Middle Ages created great shock and disgust in the public. The idea that such horrifying practices were contrary to human dignity and excessively violent compared to the crime gradually gained strength. Human rights and dignity. The principle of human rights and respect for the dignity of every individual, which forms the basis of today's law, developed with the desire that such cruel punishments not be experienced again. Proportionality of punishments. The principle that the punishment should be proportional to the severity of the crime is a result of the heavy punishments given for minor crimes in the Middle Ages. Today, even thinking of a hand amputation penalty for theft is impossible. The development of prisons, the transformation of imprisonment, based on deprivation of liberty, into the primary punishment instead of death or maiming, is a reaction to the barbarity of physical punishments in the Middle Ages. Although modern prisons aim for rehabilitation, their origins lie in this transformation. Class justice and double standards. The rule of law. The double standard justice applied to nobles and commoners emphasized the importance of the principle of the rule of law. The principle of equality before the law in modern law was born as a reaction to this discrimination in the Middle Ages. Now, even a king or a rich person is expected to be held responsible for their crime like an ordinary citizen. The influence of church law and secularization. The absolute power of the church in medieval law, especially in the Inquisition, led to the separation of trials and punishments based on religious beliefs from the legal systems of secular states. Secular legal systems. Today's legal systems are based on secular foundations, independent of religious authorities. This is a result of the intertwined nature of religion, state, and law in the Middle Ages. Freedom of conscience and expression. Heavy punishments for religious heresy crimes eventually contributed to the safeguarding of fundamental rights like freedom of conscience and expression. In summary, medieval punishments left not a direct legacy to modern law, but rather a negative legacy teaching what not to do. This dark period has been a powerful historical lesson that encouraged humanity to build a fairer, more humane, and more rational justice system. Many of the legal safeguards we enjoy today are the result of painful experiences of the past. Symbols of justice, the sword and the scales. Throughout the Middle Ages, the justice mechanism was deeply connected to both earthly and divine power. This connection was conveyed to the public through powerful symbols that embodied justice. The most prominent of these symbols were the sword and the scales. These two objects represented the different but complementary aspects of justice and visually summarized the legal philosophy of the period. The sword, the representative of authority, execution, and order. The sword associated with justice undoubtedly symbolized the absolute power of the state or ruler, the authority to punish, and the ability to maintain order in the Middle Ages. Instrument of execution. The sword was a tool used especially in the execution of nobles, beheading. In this feature, it represented the authority of the death penalty and the ultimate decision of authority. A sword in an executioner's hand was not just a weapon but also a physical manifestation of the power of the law. Order provider. In the feudal order, lords and kings resorted to the power of the sword to maintain order in their lands and suppress rebellions. The sword expressed legitimate violence and the inviolability of authority. Connection between war and law. In that era, war and law were intertwined. Rulers protected and expanded their lands and laws by the force of the sword. In this context, the sword was a tool used to define and secure the boundaries of justice. The scales, the representative of balance, equity, and measure. The scales, on the other hand, represented the more rational, measured, and equitable aspect of justice in the Middle Ages. Although often interrupted in practice, it symbolized the principle of balance and impartiality that formed the basis of justice in theory. Equivalence and proportionality, the scales symbolized that the punishment should be proportional to the gravity of the crime. The philosophy of giving an equivalent response to the evil done, as in the principle of retaliation, overlapped with the scales' quest for balance. Impartial judgment, the ideal. The two pans of the scales represented that both parties, accuser and accused, arguments and evidence should be evaluated with equal weight in the trial process. This expressed the desire for justice to be applied equally to everyone in theory, although in practice, distinctions between nobles and commoners could cause deviations from this ideal. Revealing the truth, in some symbolic representations, the scales are also seen as symbolizing the instrument that would reveal truth and justice. The union of sword and scales. In medieval art and iconography, justice was often depicted as a female figure with blindfolded eyes, symbolizing impartiality, holding a sword in one hand and scales in the other. This symbolism showed that justice had both a decisive and punitive power and was at the same time in search of balance and equity. These two symbols emphasized both the divine and worldly aspects of justice in medieval society, as well as its destructive and regulatory aspects. The sword represented the state's power to apply punishment, while the scales represented the desire for the legal process to be fair. This balance narrated the complex nature of the legal system of that era and how power was intertwined with justice. Treason, crimes against the king and state. In the Middle Ages, a king's throne was sometimes protected against something sharper than a sword, treason. As they say, the greatest enemy comes from within. In this period as well, a king's greatest fear was a blow coming from his own subjects. Any act of treason against the king, state, or dynasty was not just a crime but also meant a violation of absolute power and divine order. Therefore, the king's wrath and the punishments to be given were of unimaginable proportions. Death was sometimes not even considered sufficient. The real aim was to teach a lesson and disturb the sleep of anyone thinking of betrayal. In the Middle Ages, treason was considered the heaviest crime a person could commit. This crime was a direct attack on the ruler's authority, the unity of the state, and the social order itself. Treason was perceived not only as a worldly violation but also as a sin committed against the royal authority sanctified by God. Therefore, punishments given for the crime of treason were much more violent, cruel, and often of a quality carrying symbolic destruction than those applied for other crimes. Scope of the crime of treason. Although the concept of treason was not as clearly defined as today, it generally covered attempt or plotting of assassination against the ruler, attempting to kill the king or forming a conspiracy in this direction. Leading a rebellion or uprising, starting or leading an armed rebellion against the ruler or state. Collaboration with the enemy, aiding the state's enemies during war or peacetime, spying, or disclosing secrets. Surrendering lands to the enemy, handing over a castle, city, or region to the enemy. Forgery, counterfeiting the royal seal or minting counterfeit money. This was a direct attack on the king's sovereignty. Crimes against the royal family, harming or conspiring against a member of the royal family. These accusations could sometimes also be used as a tool to eliminate political opponents. The king's wrath and the high punishments applied. Since treason was seen as an attack on the ruler's personal authority, the punishment was usually a reflection of the king's wrath. These punishments aimed not only to kill the criminal but also to instill absolute fear in society by targeting their reputation, family, and lineage. Drawing and quartering, in England one of the most horrific methods applied for treason, especially in England. The criminal usually went through these stages: hanging. The convict was hanged in a non-fatal manner to be strangled but taken down before death so they would feel the pain longer. Disemboweling. While alive, their abdomen was slit open, internal organs removed and burned before their eyes. Beheading. Finally, their head was cut off. Quartering. The corpse was divided into 4 parts, and these parts along with the severed head were hung at different city gates or important places in the country as a lesson. This punishment aimed both to inflict the greatest physical pain and to humiliate even the criminal's corpse. Burning at the stake. Female traitors were generally preferred to be executed by burning. This was both a punishment and a symbol of social purification. Beheading. Although considered a more honorable execution, it was also used for heavy treason crimes, especially for noble men. The severed heads were displayed to the public. Confiscation of property. Forfeiture. All property of the traitor was confiscated by the state. This meant not only the ruin of the criminal but also the economic destruction of their family, and inheritance rights were also lost. Staining of lineage and loss of rights. The traitor's lineage was considered stained. Their family faced social ostracism, and in some cases, nobility titles were taken from them. Public display. Traitors were usually humiliated before execution with a long procession in front of the public, subjected to insults and attacks. Public executions as spectacle and social control. One of the most distinctive features of punishments applied in the Middle Ages was their execution in public. Gallows, burning stakes, display poles, and later guillotines were usually set up at the most crowded and visible points like city squares, palace fronts, marketplaces, or sides of main roads. This practice ensured that the punishment targeted not only the criminal but the entire society. Primary aims of executions. Maximum deterrence. The biggest goal was to send a powerful message. The pain suffered by the criminal and their exemplary end aimed to completely deter others from similar actions. These terrifying images displayed concretely showed how heavy the price of crime could be. Emphasizing the power of the state/authority, executions symbolize the absolute authority of the ruler or local lord and their power to administer justice. The public, watching these ceremonies, understood how ruthless and determined central power could be. Thus, obedience was reinforced. The executioner and execution tools were concrete symbols of this power. A bloody entertainment element. Although it seems horrific and inhumane from the perspective of modern values, public executions in the Middle Ages also carried an element of spectacle or entertainment for society. Especially as part of a monotonous and difficult daily life, such events attracted large crowds. Crowd gatherings. Executions were one of the rare social events where the public gathered, like theater plays, festivals, or religious ceremonies. People could even come from surrounding villages to watch the execution. Social event. Execution day was also like a market or social gathering day. Spectators, food and drink vendors, merchants, and even beggars were present in these areas. The place of media. In that era, without today's communication tools, executions were the most effective media tool that delivered the message to the public directly and visually. However, this entertainment concept was more a mixture of horror and curiosity than a situation of enjoyment in today's sense. Executions reflected the darkest aspects of society and showed how fragile and worthless human life could be perceived in that era. This situation is also one of the fundamental reasons why modern legal systems abandoned such practices and moved punishment execution away from the public eye. Conclusion: the enduring fascination with medieval justice. The more we talk about that terrifying justice system of the Middle Ages, the more our hair stands on end, isn't it? You might say, thank goodness those days are behind us, but strangely, the bloody punishments, torture instruments, and public executions of that dark period continue to fascinate and pique our curiosity even in the modern age. So why does this past, incomparably more cruel than today's legal systems, still attract our interest? Why does it still become the subject of movies and books? Despite its ruthlessness, primitive methods, and double standards, medieval justice is a historical segment that continues to occupy the modern human mind. Compared to today's developed legal systems and human rights understanding, the practices of that era seem barbaric and unacceptable. So why does this period still arouse so much curiosity? Confrontation with the dark side of human nature, medieval justice exposes the darkest, most violent, and most ruthless aspects of human nature. Torture instruments, bloody executions, and public humiliations are proof of how much harm people can inflict on others. This confrontation arouses both horror and a kind of fascination in us. Because we try to understand the past so that such events are not experienced again. Understanding the scope of power and authority, in that era, law was used not only to punish criminals but also to consolidate the absolute authority of the state, church, or feudal lords. The showy, public manner of punishments and executions was a concrete manifestation of power. This reminds us of how political power needs to be controlled and how unchecked power can be destructive. The evolution of law and the Enlightenment process, the justice understanding of the Middle Ages provides a background for understanding why and how the principles forming the basis of modern legal systems, fair trial, presumption of innocence, prohibition of torture, proportionality of punishments, emerged. The lessons drawn from this dark period show how valuable today's human rights norms and the principle of the rule of law are. This is proof of humanity's steps from barbarism towards civilization. Dramatic and visual potential, images like torture instruments, knights' duels, witch hunts, and gallows are naturally dramatic and visually striking. These elements provide a rich source of material for literature, cinema, and art. These visuals, which keep people's curiosity alive, convey the tragedy and tension of the period to the modern viewer. The variability of the concept of justice, medieval justice shows that the concept of justice is not absolute and how it can differ according to society's beliefs, values, and power structures. This encourages us to question our own justice systems and constantly strive for better. The attraction of fear and curiosity. In human psychology, fear and curiosity are intertwined. While medieval punishments create a shudder and shock in humans, they also trigger a deep curiosity about how and why these terrible things happened. This is a natural interest in the unknown and the difficult to understand. In short, medieval justice is not just a period of savagery left in the past. It is both a dark and enlightening legacy that offers us a rich lesson for understanding the complexity of human nature, the allure of power, the evolution of justice, and humanity's effort to achieve better. Yes, dear listener, we have come to the end of another history journey. Until we meet again tomorrow.